The night that never left him. Do you know how one moment can change how the world sees you? Do you know how it feels when millions laugh, but your heart stays silent? This story begins on a night that Keanu Reeves wished he could forget. It was late evening in Los Angeles, years before the internet turned every small gesture into a headline. The air inside the studio was cold, filled with bright lights and louder laughter. People had gathered to watch a popular talk show host who built his fame by mocking others. Tonight, his target was the quiet actor who had already faced too much loss and pain, yet still smiled when no one else could. Keanu sat there with the same calm he always carried, the same stillness that seemed to unsettle people who didn't understand peace. The host began with light jokes, the kind people expect on television. The audience laughed, and Keanu laughed too. But then the tone changed. The host looked at him, paused for effect, and said something about his slow way of speaking, about how his expressions seemed empty, about how people wondered if he even understood what acting meant. The audience roared with laughter. They didn't know what those words meant to a man who had lived through silence, grief, and isolation. Keanu smiled again, gently, the same way he always did when pain visited him. He leaned forward slightly, hands together, as if to show there was no anger in him. His eyes softened, but inside, a small part of him withdrew further into quiet. The host continued, now encouraged by the crowd's reaction. He imitated Keanu's slow speech, his still gaze, his pauses between words. The camera zoomed in on Keanu's face, and for a second, just a second, his smile broke. No one noticed except one woman sitting backstage waiting for her cue, Sandra Bullock. Years earlier, they had shared something honest during the filming of Speed. She always said he was unlike anyone she had ever met, someone who treated silence like gold and fame like dust. When she saw him sitting there, being laughed at by strangers, she felt a deep sting she couldn't explain. She wanted to walk out there and stop it, but she didn't. She was younger then, less brave, more worried about rules and appearances. She watched, and that memory stayed with her for years. After the show ended, Keanu quietly shook the host's hand and thanked him for inviting him. No anger, no sharp reply, no bitterness. He walked out of the studio alone, through a corridor lined with posters of smiling faces. Each step echoed against the cold floor, and with every echo he reminded himself to stay kind no matter how cruel the world became. Outside, a small group of fans waited for him. One little girl held a handmade poster that said, "You are my hero, Neo." Keanu knelt down, smiled, and signed it. The girl's mother later said he took time to talk to her daughter for 10 minutes, even though no cameras were around. That night, the same man who had been laughed at on live television became someone's quiet hero again. Back inside the studio, Sandra approached the host. She asked him softly, almost politely, why he went so far. He laughed and said, "It's all part of the show." She said nothing after that. But that moment carved something inside her, a promise she didn't know she would keep years later. The following weeks were strange. Tabloids printed the jokes from the show. Memes were born before memes had a name. People shared clips of the host mocking Keanu's calmness. Some called him awkward, others called him strange. Keanu said nothing. He just kept working, showing up on sets, thanking everyone, never once mentioning what happened that night. But deep inside, he began to see fame differently. It wasn't admiration anymore, it was noise. He spent more time with his bike, more time alone, more time visiting small cafes and bookstores where no one recognized him. Sometimes he met people who only saw him as a kind stranger, and those moments became his peace. Sandra, on the other hand, couldn't forget that night. She started noticing how often people mistake silence for weakness and kindness for simplicity. She had admired Keanu before, but after that incident, her respect turned into something stronger, something close to quiet loyalty. 1 year later, she saw the same talk show host again. He was interviewing another actor, mocking him for crying during an emotional scene. She turned off the TV. She realized the world had learned to celebrate cruelty disguised as humor. But fate has its own rhythm, and years later, when that same host invited her to his show, unaware of how much had changed, Sandra saw a chance to do what she couldn't do before, and what she said that night would leave the world silent. The return to the same stage. Do you know how time changes people? But not the moments they carry inside. Do you know how it feels to walk back into the place where silence once hurt? That was the feeling Sandra Bullock carried the day she received the invitation. It had been almost 10 years since that talk show episode aired. The host had become even more famous. His humor had turned sharper, his audience louder. His team sent Sandra the invitation with bright enthusiasm, calling it a reunion special. They wanted to celebrate her success, her new films, her awards. She read the email twice and smiled quietly. They had no idea that the stage they wanted her to stand on was the same one where she once saw kindness humiliated. She didn't answer immediately. She closed her laptop and walked outside her home in Austin, where the evening breeze touched her hair. It was quiet there, surrounded by trees and faint golden light. For years, she had learned to guard her peace, to protect the soft parts of her heart that fame tried to harden. And yet, that night came back like a wound that never fully healed. She saw Keanu's calm face again, the laughter, the flashing cameras, the silence that followed. The next day, she called someone she hadn't spoken to in months. "Keanu," she said softly, "do you remember that night?" He paused. His voice, still calm and slow, carried no bitterness. "Yes," he said, "but it's just a night. Nothing more." "It wasn't nothing," she whispered. There was silence between them, but it wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that carries shared understanding, the kind that only people who have walked through the same fire can recognize. Sandra told him about the invitation. He chuckled lightly. "Are you thinking of going?" "I don't know," she said. "A part of me wants to, but not for the reasons they think." He smiled through the line, and she could almost feel it. "If you go, just be you. That's enough." His words stayed with her. Not advice, not encouragement, just truth. Over the next week, Sandra thought about what she would say if she went. She didn't want revenge. She didn't want to embarrass anyone. She wanted something simple, to remind the world that kindness was not weakness, and that humility could still command respect. The day of the show arrived. She stood backstage, the same hallway where she once waited years ago, the same smell of coffee, makeup, and nervous laughter. The lights were the same too, bright, almost blinding. She felt her heart race, not with fear, but with memory. The host walked up to her before the show began. His hair was grayer now, his voice deeper. He smiled with practiced warmth. "Sandra, so good to have you back," he said. She smiled politely. "Thank you for having me," he laughed. "Can you believe it's been so many years? I hope I didn't make fun of you too much back then." Her eyes softened. "Not me," she said. "Someone else." He didn't understand at first. He just nodded and turned away. When the show started, the crowd clapped loudly. The music played, the cameras rolled, the stage looked bigger than ever. Sandra walked in wearing a simple black dress, nothing flashy, just elegant. The audience stood and cheered. The host began with jokes, as always. She smiled politely, answered his first few questions calmly. And then, halfway through, he leaned forward with that same smirk. "The one he used years ago. You and Keanu," he said. "You two always had this quiet connection. But tell me, do you ever get tired of his silence?" The audience laughed softly. Sandra looked at him. This time she didn't smile. For a moment, she let the silence stretch. People thought she was thinking, but she was remembering. "You know," she began softly, "Keanu's silence is the reason people listen when he speaks." The audience grew still. There's a kind of strength in not needing to prove anything. He never fights back, even when people try to make him small. I've seen that, and I've learned from it. The host shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to being answered that way. She continued, her voice steady but filled with quiet emotion. "Years ago, I watched someone laugh at him on this very stage. I said nothing then. I've regretted that for a long time. But what I've learned since is that dignity doesn't need defense. Kindness doesn't need applause. Keanu taught me that." The room fell silent. No laughter, no music. Only the sound of breathing and camera clicks in the distance. The host tried to recover, smiling awkwardly. "Well, he's lucky to have a friend like you." Sandra nodded. "No," she said gently. "We're lucky to have someone like him in this world." When the show ended, People backstage were quiet. Even the staff who had worked with the host for years looked at Sandra differently. One of the young crew members whispered, "That was beautiful." As she left the studio, Sandra felt a strange lightness in her chest. Not triumph, not victory, something deeper. Peace. She looked up at the night sky and whispered, "That was for you." The next morning, clips of her interview spread everywhere. Not because of controversy, not because of gossip, but because of sincerity. Headlines read, "Sandra Bullock reminds the world what respect looks like." Millions of people shared her words, calling it one of the most powerful moments on television. Keanu, sitting in a quiet cafe in New York, saw the clip on his phone. He smiled, put it down, and took a slow sip of his coffee. The woman at the next table looked at him and said, "You must be proud." He just smiled again and said, "No, just grateful." But something deeper was about to happen. What Sandra didn't know was that the host's life was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would bring both regret and redemption in ways no one saw coming. The apology that no one expected due. You know how guilt hides behind laughter until one moment breaks it open, do you? Know how one act of grace can make even the proudest heart tremble that was. What the talk show host began to feel after that. Night days passed, and Sandra's words echoed everywhere. Clips of her interview played across the internet. People shared them with captions about empathy, kindness, and quiet strength. But for the man who once made millions laugh at another's pain, those words were not just trending quotes. They were reminders. He couldn't sleep properly for days. He replayed the old episode, the one where he mocked Keanu, the one where he laughed too loudly and smiled too widely. This time, he didn't hear the audience cheering. He only heard the silence between their laughs, the silence on Keanu's face. He had built a career on sharp humor, the kind that crossed lines for the sake of ratings. But that night, as Sandra's calm voice played on his phone saying dignity doesn't need defense, something inside him cracked. He walked into his studio the next morning. The energy was different. The crew greeted him politely, but their smiles were softer, almost cautious. For the first time, he saw his stage as something cold. The same stage that once gave him power now felt like a mirror showing him what he had become. Later that week, he called his producer and said, "Get me Keanu Reeves' number." The producer looked surprised. "Why?" he hesitated. "Because I think I owe him something." It took 2 days to reach Keanu. When the call finally connected, the host's voice trembled slightly. "Keanu, this is Mark. I don't know if you remember me." Keanu paused, then spoke gently. "Of course I do." "I saw the interview," Mark said quietly, "and I saw myself. I don't like what I saw." Keanu didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then he replied, "That's a good start." Mark exhaled. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not for the show, not for television. I'm sorry for being cruel when I could have been human." Keanu listened, his voice soft as always. "We all learn differently," he said. "Sometimes we learn late, but it's still learning." The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was freeing. Mark asked, "Could we meet?" Keanu thought for a moment. "Sure," he said. "I'm in Los Angeles next week." When they met, it wasn't in a studio or a restaurant. It was in a small public park near Sunset Boulevard. Keanu arrived first, sitting quietly on a bench feeding a few pigeons. Mark walked slowly toward him, holding a paper bag with 2 coffees. He sat down beside him, unsure how to begin. "You know," Mark said nervously, "when you're young in this business, they tell you to be bold, to be funny, to never be boring. They don't tell you that in trying to be entertaining, you can forget how to be kind." Keanu looked at the sky. "It happens," he said. "But we always get to choose how to change." Mark nodded, his voice breaking slightly. "That night, you smiled even when I went too far." "Why?" Keanu's eyes softened. "Because if I stopped smiling, it would have turned into anger. And anger feeds what hurt you in the first place. I didn't want to be part of that." For a long time, they sat in silence. No cameras, no scripts, no audience. Just 2 men, one finally understanding the weight of laughter and the other showing that forgiveness isn't weakness. After a while, Mark said, "I want to do something right this time. I want to invite you back on the show, but not to talk about movies. I want to talk about kindness, about what the world needs to remember. Keanu smiled faintly. If we do it, it has to be real. It will be, Mark said. No jokes, no act, just truth. A few weeks later, the episode aired. It wasn't like anything the audience had seen before. The lights were dimmer, the tone slower, the laughter replaced with reflection. Mark began the show by saying, "Years ago, I made a mistake on this stage. Tonight, I want to make peace with it." When Keanu walked in, the audience clapped softly, almost respectfully. Mark stood and hugged him. It wasn't dramatic. It was honest. They talked for almost an hour. Keanu spoke about loss, grief, and kindness. He said, "The world doesn't need more clever people. It needs more gentle ones." Every word carried weight. People online later said it was one of the most real interviews they had ever seen. After the show, as they walked backstage, Mark stopped and said, "Thank you for giving me another chance." Keanu smiled. "You gave it to yourself." Later that night, he called Sandra. "It's done," he said softly. She smiled through the phone. "I knew you'd handle it your way," he chuckled. "Your way helped too." "Maybe," she said. "But I think the world just needed to see what forgiveness looks like." But fate wasn't done weaving its quiet lessons. One day, months later, Keanu and Sandra would find themselves at another event, one that would test everything they had both stood for. An event where humility, kindness, and pain would all collide once again, forcing them to make a choice between silence and truth. The night the world watched again, do you know how life brings you back to the same kind of moment until you master it? Do you know how silence can speak, louder than applause when truth walks into the room? That was the kind of night Keanu and Sandra were about to face. It was a charity gala in Los Angeles. One of those glittering nights where cameras flash endlessly and everyone wears a mask of perfection. The event was for children's hospitals, and both Keanu and Sandra had been invited as honored guests. They had not shared a stage since that talk show apology, but fate had other plans. The evening began softly. People smiled, champagne glasses clinked, and speeches about kindness filled the air. Keanu arrived quietly, dressed in his usual simple black suit. He never liked attention. He moved through the crowd with his calm presence, stopping to thank volunteers, kneeling to speak to children, smiling with genuine warmth. There was no performance in him, only grace. Sandra arrived a few minutes later. She wore a deep blue gown, elegant but modest. When she entered, she spotted Keanu across the hall. Their eyes met and both smiled, a small shared acknowledgement of everything they had been through. For a while, the evening went beautifully. They both sat at the same table, alongside other actors, directors, and philanthropists. But the peace didn't last long. Among the crowd was a popular social media influencer known for turning kindness into mockery for views. He was filming behind-the-scenes footage for his channel. His tone was playful, his words sharp. He wanted attention, and he saw an opportunity. He approached their table with a camera crew following him. "Look who we have here," he said loudly. "The calmest man in Hollywood and the woman who defended him." "Tell me, Keanu, are you planning to meditate through this entire event?" People nearby chuckled awkwardly. The cameras zoomed in, waiting for a reaction. Keanu looked up and smiled softly. "Maybe," he said. "It's peaceful here." But the influencer didn't stop. "You know, I rewatched that old clip where you got roasted. Man, that was brutal. Do you ever laugh at yourself now?" The laughter grew a little louder. Sandra's face tightened. She had seen this pattern before. Cruelty hiding behind humor, the same way it had all started years ago. She could feel her heart pounding. Her instincts told her to stay quiet, but her conscience whispered louder this time. She placed her hand gently on the table and spoke calmly, her voice steady but sharp enough to cut through the noise. "You know," she said, "there's something beautiful about people who don't need to hurt others to be seen." The room fell silent. The influencer's smile faded. The camera kept rolling, unsure what to capture, embarrassment or truth. Keanu turned slightly, his voice soft but firm. "The world is loud enough," he said. "We don't need more noise. We need more care." The influencer froze. He tried to laugh it off, saying, "Hey, I was just joking." Sandra smiled kindly. "Then maybe try a different kind of joke, one that makes people feel better, not smaller." The moment was short but powerful. Even the crowd, filled with celebrities and executives, seemed moved. They clapped quietly, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. After that, the influencer stepped back, lowering his camera. For the first time, he looked unsure. He mumbled an apology and walked away. The cameras captured everything, and within hours, that small exchange would become one of the most watched clips of the year. As the night went on, Keanu and Sandra didn't speak much about it. They continued with their evening, helping auction items, thanking organizers, talking with guests. But when the gala ended and they walked outside into the quiet street, the conversation they had was soft and unforgettable. "You didn't have to do that," Keanu said gently. Sandra smiled. "Maybe I did. Maybe I needed to prove to myself that silence can be strong, but sometimes words can heal too." He looked at her, a faint smile on his lips. "You've changed," she nodded. "We both have." The next morning, the internet exploded with clips of the gala. People called it the most graceful confrontation ever captured on camera. Hashtags about empathy and respect filled social media. Even the influencer posted a message saying they were right. I forgot that being kind is also powerful. But beyond the noise, beyond the headlines, something deeper was happening. Keanu and Sandra's quiet friendship had turned into something that inspired millions. Journalists began calling them the calm hearts of Hollywood, a phrase Keanu found both strange and ironic. A week later, Keanu received a letter at his home. No name, no signature, just words written in shaky handwriting. "Dear Keanu, I was the camera operator that night when the host mocked you years ago. I laughed along with everyone else. I thought it was just my job. After all these years, I still think about it. When I saw what you and Sandra did at the gala, I realized what real humanity looks like. Thank you for reminding me." He folded the letter and placed it on his bookshelf beside a small photo. One from the early days of Speed, where he and Sandra were smiling, young and full of light. He looked at it for a long time that night, thinking how the world changes people through small, quiet ripples, but even peace has its tests. And just when things seemed calm, news came that would challenge both of them again. Something deeply personal. Something that would make them face their pasts not as stars, but as humans who still carried unseen scars. When pain finds its way home, do you know how life waits for the quiet ones before it tests their hearts again? Do you know how even the strongest smiles can hide the most fragile memories? That was how Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock entered the hardest chapter of their story. It began one ordinary morning. Sandra woke to her phone buzzing beside her bed. Her publicist's voice was trembling. "Sandra," she said softly, "there's been news about Keanu." Her heart stopped. "What kind of news?" "He's fine," the woman said quickly, "but someone close to him isn't." Keanu's best friend, an old stage designer he had known since his early acting days, had passed away suddenly in a car accident. They had worked together, traveled together, and shared countless late-night conversations about life, pain, and purpose. Keanu had lost people before. His parents, his sister's long illness, the love of his life years ago. But every new loss opened an old door inside him. When Sandra called him that afternoon, he answered with a soft hello, but his voice was empty. "I heard," she said quietly. "Yeah?" he replied after a pause. "I thought I was used to it by now, but I'm not." "You never get used to it," she said. He didn't talk much after that. She could hear the sound of wind through his window, the stillness that followed pain when words can't reach it. She wanted to go see him, but she didn't want to intrude. So she waited. A week later, she received a message from him. "Do you want to go for a ride?" She replied, "Yes." He arrived at her home with his motorcycle, the same black one he had kept for years. She sat behind him, the wind brushing against her hair as they drove through the hills. There was no destination, just movement. The kind that feels like breathing when the world is heavy. They stopped near a quiet lake outside the city. The sun was setting, painting the water gold. Keanu sat on a rock staring at the reflection and said softly, "You know, when people die, everyone tells you to be strong. But strength isn't always silence. Sometimes strength is letting yourself feel everything." Sandra nodded. You've carried a lot alone. He smiled faintly. I guess that's how I learned to walk quietly. She looked at him for a moment, then said, You taught me something different. That kindness isn't about never hurting. It's about staying gentle even when you do. They sat there in silence for a long time. Neither of them spoke about fame or films. They spoke about their parents, about the people they had lost, about nights when grief comes like a visitor that refuses to leave. As darkness settled, Keanu said, I keep thinking about that night, the one with the host. How people laughed, how I smiled through it. Sometimes I wonder if staying silent was strength or fear. Sandra looked at him, her voice soft but steady. It was grace. And grace always takes longer for the world to understand. He turned toward her. You made the world understand. She shook her head. No, you made me understand. Their friendship had become something deep, not romantic, not distant. Something that belonged to the space between two souls who recognized each other's pain and still chose peace. The following month, Keanu decided to fund a children's hospital wing in memory of his friend. He refused to announce it publicly, but the story leaked through the hospital staff. When journalists asked him about it, he simply said, We all leave something behind. I just hope mine helps someone heal. Sandra attended the opening quietly, avoiding the cameras. After the ceremony, she found him standing in a small corner of the hospital garden, watching children play. You did something beautiful, she said. They're the ones who are beautiful, he replied. They laughed like nothing ever hurt them. But as fate would have it, not everyone saw beauty in silence. A reporter published an article twisting the story, suggesting that Keanu and Sandra were using tragedy for publicity. The article spread fast, its tone cold and cynical. People began arguing online, turning compassion into noise again. Sandra saw the headlines and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Anger. Not for herself, but for him. She called him that night. They don't deserve to twist this, she said. They're just doing their job, he replied calmly. No, she said firmly. They're missing the meaning. He sighed. You can't teach meaning to people who don't listen, she paused. Then maybe it's time to make them listen. 2 days later, she did something unexpected. She contacted the same talk show host, the one who had once humiliated Keanu and later apologized, and told him she wanted to come on the show again, but this time not to talk about movies. She wanted to talk about kindness, about loss, and about what the world misunderstands about silence. The host agreed immediately. When the episode aired, it wasn't flashy or dramatic. The set was simple, the lights soft. Sandra sat in the center, her voice calm but firm. We live in a time where being loud is mistaken for being brave, she said. But I've seen real courage. It doesn't shout. It listens. It forgives. And it loves even when the world turns cruel. The host asked gently, Are you talking about Keanu? She smiled. I'm talking about anyone who's ever been laughed at for being kind. People watching from home felt something shift. The comments online changed. Headlines softened. The noise faded and sincerity took its place. That night, Keanu sent her a message. You didn't have to do that. She replied, I know. But sometimes silence needs a voice. He read her message twice, then smiled quietly. He looked outside at the city lights, thinking of how far they had come, from laughter that hurt to words that healed. But life, as always, had one more test waiting. One that would push both of them to the edge, not of fame or forgiveness, but of truth. Because sometimes the hardest thing isn't forgiving others, it's forgiving yourself. The silence that healed everything, do you know how stories don't end when the world stops watching? Do you know how the quietest truths wait until you are ready to face them? That was what Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock were about to learn. Months had passed since Sandra's heartfelt interview. The noise around them had faded, replaced by something rare in their world, respect. People began to look at them differently. Not as movie stars, not as headlines, but as reminders of what grace looks like when tested. Still, something unspoken lingered between them. Years of friendship, trust, and small moments of comfort had created a bond deeper than words. Yet there was a silence neither dared to name. Not because they didn't feel it, but because it lived in a space beyond explanation. One late evening, Keanu called Sandra. His voice was calm, but softer than usual. "I'm at the old studio," he said. "The one where it all began." She knew what he meant. The same talk show set where years ago he had been humiliated, and where everything had silently started. She didn't ask why he was there. She simply said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes. When she arrived, the building was empty. The stage lights were off, but the faint glow from the city seeped through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Keanu was sitting on the edge of the stage, his head slightly bowed, his hands folded. "I was filming nearby," he said quietly. "I just wanted to see it again." She walked closer, her heels echoing softly against the wooden floor. "Does it still hurt?" He smiled faintly. "No, it's strange. It used to be a wound. Now it's just a memory. But there's something I never told you." She sat beside him. "What is it?" He looked straight ahead, his voice low. "That night when everyone laughed, I wasn't angry. I was just tired. Tired of being misunderstood. Tired of pretending that silence didn't feel heavy. But when I looked up, I saw you backstage. You didn't say anything, but I saw your face. And somehow that made me feel less alone. That's what I carried from that night. Not the pain. Just that moment." Sandra's eyes softened. "I didn't know you saw me." "I saw everything," he said. "And when you spoke years later, when you stood up for me, I realized something. Sometimes the people who stay silent aren't weak. They're just waiting for the right time to speak love instead of anger." She smiled gently. "And sometimes people stay quiet because they're afraid of saying too much." He turned to her. "Were you?" She took a breath. "I think so. For a long time, I didn't know if the world could handle the truth. That kindness isn't something you act, it's something you are. And maybe that's why I was drawn to you. Because you never stopped being kind even when it hurt." They sat in silence again. The kind that wasn't empty, but full. Full of years, lessons, and emotions that didn't need names. After a while, Keanu said, "I used to think forgiveness was something you give to others. But now I think it's something you give to yourself first." "For what?" she asked. "For letting pain change how you see the world. For staying quiet too long. For believing that humility means hiding." She nodded slowly. "I think we both forgave ourselves tonight," he smiled. "Maybe we did." Outside, it began to rain, a slow, steady drizzle tapping against the glass. They didn't move. They just sat there. Two souls who had finally reached the stillness they had been chasing for years. When they left the studio, Keanu held the door open for her, as he always did. She looked at him one last time and said softly, "Thank you for never letting the world change you." He smiled, the same quiet smile that had survived everything. "Thank you for reminding the world it still needs kindness." In the following weeks, neither spoke publicly about that night. But something changed in both of them. Sandra began working quietly with young artists, teaching them how to stay true in an industry that rewards noise. Keanu started a small foundation in his friend's memory, helping underprivileged kids learn filmmaking. The media noticed their silence again, but this time, it wasn't misunderstood. It was celebrated. People called them symbols of dignity, proof that goodness, even when mocked, eventually becomes the loudest voice. 1 year later, they were invited together to a humanitarian award ceremony. During the event, the host asked, "What message would you give to the world right now?" Keanu paused, then looked at Sandra and said, "Be kind. Not for attention, not for applause. Just because it's right." She added softly, "And if someone laughs at your kindness, keep being kind. They'll understand one day." The crowd stood, applauding not the celebrities before them, but the humans who refused to let cruelty win. After the ceremony, as they walked outside under the night sky, Sandra looked up and said, "It's strange. Everything started with humiliation, and now it feels like peace." Keanu smiled gently. That's how stories end when they're lived with love. They stood there for a while, saying nothing. The world around them kept moving. Cars, lights, cameras, But for that brief moment, time itself seemed to stop, honoring the journey of two souls who had taught millions the quiet power of grace. And somewhere inside that silence, they both knew. The story that began with pain had ended with peace.